a young scientist, becomes obsessed with conquering death. He succeeds, and what he creates destroys everything he loves. This is Frankenstein, and why it still matters today. Published when she was just 20 years old. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is widely regarded as one of the first works of modern science fiction, blending Gothic atmosphere with philosophical questions about ambition, responsibility, and creation. The novel unfolds through a layered narrative structure, beginning not in a laboratory, but in the frozen Arctic. There, Captain Robert Walton leads an ambitious expedition in search of glory and discovery. Walton dreams of pushing beyond the known limits of the world, convinced that his determination will carry him where others have failed. It is in this desolate and dangerous landscape that his crew encounters a nearly lifeless stranger wandering across the ice, a man exhausted, broken, and alone. That man is Victor Frankenstein. As Victor recovers aboard Walton's ship, he begins to recount the events that brought him to this frozen wasteland. He makes it clear from the outset that his story is not one of triumph, but of warning. He urges Walton to learn from his mistakes, explaining that unchecked ambition and the reckless pursuit of knowledge can lead not to greatness, but to ruin. From the beginning, the novel frames itself as a confession delivered by someone who understands too late the consequences of his own actions. Victor describes his childhood in Geneva as loving and intellectually stimulating, surrounded by a devoted family who encouraged his curiosity. From a young age, he was fascinated by the mysteries of life and death, especially the question of what animates the human body. As he grew older and entered the University of Ingolstadt, his curiosity deepened into something more dangerous. He immersed himself in chemistry, anatomy, and the emerging science of electricity, becoming convinced that life itself might be governed by discoverable principles. Gradually, his studies turned into obsession. He withdrew from friends and family, neglecting his health and isolating himself in pursuit of a single goal: to unlock the secret of life and conquer death itself. What began as intellectual curiosity transformed into a consuming ambition, driven not only by the desire for knowledge but by the promise of glory and recognition. After months of secret labor, Victor succeeded in assembling a body from collected remains, believing he would create something magnificent. On a storm-filled night, he harnessed the power of electricity and brought the lifeless form to animation. The moment that should have marked the pinnacle of scientific achievement instead filled him with horror. The creature's features, which he had once imagined as beautiful, now appeared grotesque and unnatural. Overwhelmed by fear and revulsion, Victor fled from the being he had created, abandoning it without guidance, explanation, or care. In that moment, the central moral failure of the novel takes shape. The tragedy of Frankenstein does not lie solely in the act of creation, but in the refusal to accept responsibility for what has been created. Left alone, the creature experiences the world as an outsider from the very beginning. He feels hunger, cold, and confusion, but he also feels curiosity and wonder. As he wanders through forests and villages, he is repeatedly attacked and driven away because of his appearance. Eventually, he finds shelter near a small cottage inhabited by a struggling but loving family. Hidden from view, he observes them for months, teaching himself to speak, to read, and to understand human relationships. Through books and careful listening, he learns about history, morality, and emotion. He begins to long for companionship and believes that if he can present himself gently and intelligently, he might be accepted. However, when he finally reveals himself, he is met with fear and violence. This rejection devastates him and transforms his longing for connection into resentment. It is here that the creature begins to see himself as the world sees him, as a monster. Determined to confront his creator, the creature finds Victor and tells him his story. He speaks eloquently about his suffering and argues that he was not born evil, but made miserable through isolation and neglect. He makes a single request: that Victor create a female companion who will share his exile from humanity, so that they may live peacefully and far from society. Though reluctant, Victor agrees and begins constructing a second being. However, as he works, he imagines the consequences of unleashing another powerful creature into the world. Fearing that he might create a new and uncontrollable threat to humanity, he destroys the unfinished companion. When the creature witnesses this act, he feels betrayed once again and vows revenge, promising that Victor will suffer as he has suffered. The creature carries out his threat with devastating precision. Victor's younger brother is murdered, his closest friend Henry Clerval is killed, and on his wedding night, his bride Elizabeth is strangled. Each act of violence intensifies Victor's despair and guilt, yet instead of reflecting on his role in these events, he becomes consumed by vengeance. At this stage, the moral lines blur. The creature, once innocent and hopeful, has become violent through rejection and pain. Victor, who began as an ambitious scholar, has become a man driven by secrecy, pride, and rage. Mary Shelley forces readers to confront an uncomfortable question: who bears the greater responsibility for the suffering that unfolds? Determined to destroy the being he created, Victor devotes himself entirely to pursuit. The chase stretches across Europe and into the frozen northern regions, mirroring the intensity that once fueled his scientific ambition. His life narrows to a single purpose, and the obsession that once drove him to create life now drives him toward destruction. Exhausted and physically broken, Victor ultimately collapses in the Arctic, where he is rescued by Walton's expedition. As he nears death, he warns Walton not to sacrifice everything for ambition, urging him to abandon his dangerous quest before it leads to similar ruin. After Victor's death, the creature boards the ship and stands over his creator's body. In a final confession, he admits that revenge brought him no peace. Each act of violence deepened his loneliness rather than easing it. He reveals that he longed for love and companionship from the beginning, and that his crimes have left him empty and remorseful. With Victor gone and no place in the world that will accept him, the creature declares that he will disappear into the ice and end his own life. The novel closes where it began, in frozen isolation, emphasizing the consequences of ambition without empathy and creation without responsibility. Frankenstein remains powerful because it is not simply a horror story about a monster. It is a meditation on scientific responsibility, isolation, and the ethical limits of ambition. The novel challenges readers to consider what obligations come with the power to create, and how neglect and rejection can shape even the most innocent beginnings into tragedy. In the end, the true horror of Frankenstein is not the creature's appearance, but the human failure that set the tragedy in motion.